Start our service this morning. Let's just pray together. Father, we just want to thank you that we can be here and we can worship you, we can praise you this morning. And Father, while we're not physically together, as we've got used to in a lot of ways over the past few weeks, Father, we know that we are united as a church this morning, not just ourselves, but also with other believers around the world as we gather to just worship you and just think about what you've done. And Lord, we just thank you for this privilege that we have, that we can meet together with those that love you and just praise you and just worship you for what you've done, Lord. And we just want to ask that this morning you would be with us in our service. We want to ask that you would guide us, help all those who are going to be part of the service this morning. We especially pray for Mark as he brings your word to us later, Father. We just pray that that you might speak through him, Father. And we just want to ask that you would be with us in our service and that our service would just bring glory to you this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. So I just want to share a little bit of my own story this morning. So I shared with you last week that I've got a new job, and I just want to tell you a little bit more about that. So I'm going to just start by reading Romans 12, and I'm going to read from verse 9, Romans 12, verse 9. Love must be sincere, hate what is evil, cling to what is good, be devoted to one another in love, honor one another above yourselves, never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need, practice hospitality, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and mourn with those who mourn. And as a church, really, that's what we do. That's what we should do, and that's why it's so important for us to share with each other. And recently, as a church, we have mourned together. There are times when we've mourned, but there have also been times of rejoicing as well. And I want to just invite you this morning to rejoice with me. We all have stories of how God has been faithful, as we've thought about so clearly in that song. And today I just want to share with you a little bit of God's faithfulness and tell you a little bit about the story really surrounding my new job. So I was made redundant as expected at the end of October after a long period of being on furlough. Working in the English language teaching industry, it was kind of obvious that with the slowdown of travel, that the need for English teachers and English teaching in general would be lessened due to the pandemic. And so I went through the redundancy process, and to be honest with you, it was quite a long and unfair process, and made all the more difficult by the fact that I was promoted in January, and knowing that if I'd kept my old job, I would still be working. And as you know, I moved back home to be with my parents for a while I wasn't working, and that's where I am this morning. And I used my furlough pay to continue to pay for my room in London, with the expectation that I would need it again when I started working back in London. But when it became clear that redundancy was likely, I did start looking for jobs, and some of which I thought would be perfect for me, some of which I didn't really want, but I just was conscious that I had to apply and apply and apply, with the hope that I would find something. But also conscious that I haven't got a formal teaching qualification. I couldn't just walk into a secondary school and teach there. And also knowing that my industry, which is the English language teaching English industry, was in decline. And all the time you're hearing news reports that tell you that levels of unemployment are rising. And we know that's the case, don't we? And it is worrying. So I had all that going on in the back of my mind. And also I was officially made redundant on the 30th of October, which was a Friday. And as you may remember, the government announced the furlough extension on the 31st, the day after I'd been terminated. And I did ask my company if they would rehire me and put me back on furlough, which I know has happened for other people. And they said no. And so at that point, it was starting to seem a bit hopeless. Just starting to kind of affect me a little bit with the rejections that I was getting from different jobs. I'd applied to nearly 30 jobs, which doesn't really sound like much, but when you take the time to apply to all of them, it is a long time, and it does take a lot of emotional kind of strength to do that, really. And some I hadn't heard from, and some I'd got clear rejection from, and it was starting to look a bit bleak. But I did, in my search, see a job with a Christian charity, and they were looking for a teacher. And what struck me was that they were looking for experience and not a formal teaching qualification, which I obviously don't have. I applied for that job, and I was invited to interview, which was the first interview I'd been invited to. And one of the things that really struck me was at the start of the first interview, which was on Zoom, they asked if they could pray for me. And that was something that I've never really experienced in a job interview before. And it was also the first time I felt like I couldn't really lie in an interview, or at least bend the truth. And I was then, after that interview, I was then asked to plan and teach a lesson as part of the interview process. And I came to London, came to Hammersmith for the day to go into the education centre to teach that lesson. I was really nervous, as most people are before a lesson or before an interview, but this was just especially nervous, knowing that this was the only interview I'd had and the only chance that I had of working again, really. But as I walked through the door, my nerves just left me, and I just felt totally calm. And they kept asking me if I was okay, and I just said, yeah, absolutely fine. I felt so calm and so at peace. And then, as I shared with you, I found out last week that I got the job on Friday, and I'm obviously very thankful, and I feel very blessed as well, having heard or hearing other people's stories, as Alice has shared as well this morning. I know there's still people in our church that are going through this time of uncertainty with regards to work, but for me the timing has been perfect, and God's provision means that I can keep my room in London, which is a big answer to prayer, and so I can continue to live in London. I'm even more thrilled that I can be working for a Christian charity. So the charity is TLG, or Transforming Lives for Good, and they help children who are in crisis within their education. And although it's not a Christian school as such, they don't claim to be a Christian school, all the staff are Christians, and there is a prayer meeting every morning before work, which will be very new for me. But I start that job on Wednesday, and I just want to thank everyone for praying for me, and also just to encourage us to continue to take time to pray for each other. That feeling of peace that I had when I walked into that interview room, I know is as a result of people praying for me. And it's just a reminder that we will all go through difficult times. And I know some people will be going through and will go through more difficult times than I've been through. But it's good to trust God, and it's good to just be reminded of his faithfulness. And also I had a quote this week that I just want to share with you, because sometimes in difficult and hopeless situations, we ask, when can I get out of this? When is this going to end? When can this stop? When can I move on to the next phase of my life? But instead we should ask, what can I get out of this? What can I learn from the situation? What story of God's faithfulness will I be able to tell at the end of it? And throughout my time looking for jobs, I was reminded of those verses in Isaiah, which I just want to share with you before we listen to another song. And it's a song that's kind of helped me through this time that I want to share with you. But before that, we're just going to read from Isaiah 55. Very familiar verses, but very truthful verses as well, especially at this time. And Isaiah 55 and verse 8, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. And so I just want to encourage you this morning, and also just want to just reassure you that it's going to be okay. And I just want to share with you the words of this song. And I'm going to ask Paula to play that now. The song is called You're Still God. Thanks, Paula.
When all foundations have been shaken, when I'm left standing in the dark, and all I feel is my heart breaking, you still reign and you're still God.
So we're going to lead into a time of communion shortly, but before we do that, I'm just going to ask Shirley to just lead us into that. So thanks, Shirley.
Thank you, Alice. That's a wonderful song. I really didn't know that one, but what a wonderful testimony. I just actually sent it to a friend this morning, and she came back to me very quickly, said, "How did you know I was struggling so much this morning?" So it's a wonderful song. Thank you, Alice, and thank you to all who have been sharing this morning. It's a joy to be with you all. Since our recent move to a flat in Finchley, I have been exploring the area to discover that a fairly large cemetery is close by. In one of my strolls amidst the tombstones, some thoughts have been swirling around my brain and heart, causing me to reflect on the word hope and its present reality in my life and in yours. As a follow-up to Harry's message last week, and with particular reference to Jesus' remark that the kingdom of God is close at hand, I felt I wanted to share with you how I've been encouraged. With God's help, may I see things how they truly are. Is our hope selfish or even mean-spirited? Are we hoping for just our heart's desire, or for a hope that lifts all spirits, even for that leader or that politician who you most resent? We want to see detectable hope, yet we all visit headstones of failed hope. Perhaps it's consistent employment, perhaps it's good physical or mental health, or just a break from that persistent pain, or for a faithful partner, or maybe you're looking at the bigger picture and you hope for world peace, or whatever it is that you're hoping for. We want our hopes to be fresh and fruitful, and I'm sure we all at times deeply long for things to be different. I would like to focus a little on the miracle of Jesus and the fig tree. Let's just take time to read. It's in Mark 11, and it's just 3 verses. And verse 12, the next morning, as they were leaving Bethany, Jesus was hungry. He noticed a fig tree in full leaf a little way off. So he went over to see if he could find any figs. But there were only leaves because it was too early in the season for fruit. Then Jesus said to the tree, "May no one ever eat your fruit again." And the disciples heard him say it. You know, this was Jesus' single miracle of judgment. Every other miracle was performed in compassion, mercy, and love, which makes this one stands out in severity. Jesus draws sobering lessons from it in other passages in the Gospels, but for the purpose of this devotional, I'd like to center our thoughts just a little on Jesus' failed hope. This particular fig tree, unusual for the time of year, gave the impression of fruitfulness as the leaves were green and lush. Other trees didn't raise expectations as they were without leaves. He eagerly reached his hand into the tree. And in his humanity, he longed for it to be different. But there was no fig, not even a bud, no hope of sweetness. Jesus then doesn't hide his disappointment. I wonder if he lifted his shoulders and let them fall again with a heavy sigh of despair. Probably. As a man and as the one who came to rescue us from our humanity, his dashed hope was apparent in these shocking words as he curses the tree. May no one eat from this tree ever again. In saying this, Jesus opened another window into our shared humanity. I'm so glad he said it, as it revealed the depth of his understanding of our fallenness. Sometimes the death of hope is the kickstart into present reality, a needed shove into its embrace. God then sits with us in the death of hope so that we can rise again with renewed hope. As many of us know, dashed hope can be a full-on nightmare. The show is over. What's the point? Will we ever smile again? Yet, as we rise to meet each day, the wheels of life continue to turn. The sun rises, we gaze out of the window. The clouds drift, the branches of the trees continue to sway, the leaves fall. As we face the day, the streets are lined with real people, each living out their lives with varying degrees of hopefulness. And as you hear their stories of pain and dashed hopes, you feel inspired by their resilience to keep on hoping for better days, a trigger which keeps you going. Keep looking at the reality and you will see another project. Recently, Mark and I were watching a programme revealing the devastation of the pandemic in picturesque Cornwall, the underbelly of a county dependent on tourism. In the face of reality of abject poverty, one couple started a food bank, bringing hope to many desperate families. In the recent death of his wife and in her memory, the bereaved widower just keeps going. Have you run out of hope for the nation? Or indeed for the world? Are the effects of the virus on the economy and health of its people causing you to despair? Yet, it's been a pattern of life down throughout our turbulent history. Things come to a brutal end, over and over and over again. Graves are dug, devastating laments fill the air. Still, green shoots appear, life returns. And as you reach out to the needs around you, hope returns for another season. Anticipatory hope isn't enough anymore. Participatory hope is the only kind that will work. I've been inspired recently by celebrity Jose Andres, who founded the World Central Kitchen in response to the hurricane in Haiti in 2010, providing meals to the hungry. Since the start of the pandemic, WCK has provided 25 million meals. Their motto? Feeding millions, one plate at a time. The work going on and through our cafe brings delight to the heart of the Father. This is pure religion. Resilience is needed in the face of relentless death. As an example, we see this in our NHS intensive care workers who nourish hope in the midst of crushing defeat. Hope is a marathon, not a sprint. Yet, let's be encouraged. It's not just a hope beyond the grave, but it's a hope in the midst and messiness of the tombstones of failed hope in our everyday lives, in the kingdom of God's grace. God is no stranger to the graveyard where you go to bury your hopes. The gardener is already there. He knows your name. And he's planting new bulbs. Let's just pray as we lead into communion. God of all hopefulness, we offer you the adoration of our hearts. You reached into the depths and intricacies of our being, in and through Jesus, the one you sacrificed to free us from the hopelessness of our humanity. In paying that price, dear Jesus, we have now been set free from that loss of hope which threatens to consume us. Today and each day we place our hand into your hand so that together we can walk undefeated, no matter the path, no matter the cost. And as we listen to this song, we take the bread and the wine, reminding us of that path of suffering, yet joy you walked for us.
I have a maker. He formed my heart before even time began. My life was in his hand. He knows my name.
Thanks for sharing with us and bringing your reflection to us this morning. And we're just going to invite in a moment, Mark is going to come and speak to us. And he's going to be speaking on Mark chapter 9, verses 1 to 32. And before he does that, I've just asked Paula if she wouldn't mind reading those verses to us. So thanks, Paula.
So Mark chapter 9, verse 1. And he said to them, truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the kingdom of God has come with power. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up a high mountain, where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud. This is my son, whom I love. Listen to him. Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing what rising from the dead meant. And then they asked him, why do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? Jesus replied, to be sure, Elijah does come first and restores all things. Why, then it is written that the Son of Man must suffer much and be rejected. But I tell you, Elijah has come, and they have done to him everything they wished, just as it is written about him. When they came to the disciples, they saw a large crowd around them, and the teachers of the law arguing with them. As soon as the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. What are you arguing with them about? He asked. A man in the crowd answered, Teacher, I brought you my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not. You unbelieving generation, Jesus replied. How long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me. So they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked the boy's father, how long has he been like this? From childhood, he answered. It has often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. But if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. If you can, said Jesus, everything is possible for the one who believes. Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. You deaf and mute spirit, he said, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again. The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, he's dead. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, why couldn't we drive it out? He replied, this kind can only come out by prayer. Then he left that place and passed through Galilee. Jesus did not want anyone to know where they were, because he was teaching his disciples. He said to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and after 3 days he will rise. But they did not understand what he meant and were afraid to ask him about it.
Thanks very much, Paula, for reading what is a fairly lengthy passage. But this morning we are going to look at the Transfiguration and that interesting incident that is recorded as part of the Transfiguration. We've been thinking quite a bit this morning about hope and the realization of hope and the incredible joy, rightly, that brings. And we've been able to rejoice this morning with Alice, with others, for things hoped for and trusting God for that have been realized. But what about the anticipation of the dashing of hope? Surely briefly referred to walks around cemeteries, and I don't know if you walk around cemeteries. We walk around cemeteries. They are valuable, interesting, intriguing, sobering, helpful places to walk around, to reflect on the lives of others. We do it with our loved ones, and it's a valuable thing to do. And the reference you made to tombstones of dashed hope. And I've been just reflecting in the few moments as about to start this message on how do you help your friends cope with the total crushing of their hopes and aspirations. Anticipating hope is a great encouragement, but anticipating the crushing of hope, to be frank, as humans, that's something we cannot cope with. It's one reason why God has mercifully and graciously kept the detail of our personal futures from us. And while sometimes we long for prophecy and knowledge of the future, quite frankly, God didn't make us with the capacity to handle detailed future, because the crushing of hope and the anticipation of that would be more than our minds could take. It's hard enough to take it when it actually comes. Jesus is exactly in that situation. He is fully aware, increasingly fully aware of who he is, and he is fully aware and increasingly getting closer to fulfilling what he knows he has to do. How does he help his friends deal with what lies ahead? I titled this message, Transfiguration, the Grappling with the Unthinkable. The Grappling with the Unthinkable. And I want us, as we reflect on this story this morning, to think about a number of unthinkable things, which Jesus is actually trying to help his friends deal with and prepare for. They are unaware that they have to prepare for this, but he is aware. And the Transfiguration, in one sense, is a glorious way of encouraging them and giving them a picture of something which is going to help them when everything appears to be lost and crushed. At the same time this morning, in a sense, we're going to take a break from the Gospel of Mark after this Sunday. And so I want us to reflect a little bit back over the half of the book that we have been through, because it ties in so powerfully with the passage that we have just read. As we began the Gospel of Mark and as we saw those introductions, the Gospel of Mark is not a novel. Typically, with a novel, you turn to the last page in order to know the end of the story. And some of us creep to the end of books to check out a story before we decide whether we're going to read it or not. The Gospel of Mark is written more like a scientific treatise or thesis, or a historical document or thesis. And so Mark quite simply puts the conclusion at the beginning so that we know what it is that he's writing about and what he's going to demonstrate. And he's demonstrating that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. And that is the good news. And that's what we have been focused on as we've been going through these studies together. And loosely speaking, and the Gospel of Mark is a difficult one to subdivide up, but roughly speaking, the first 8 chapters very much focus on the introduction to us of Jesus as the Messiah, as the Christ. And we saw in Mark chapter 8 last week how Peter makes that confession, that declaration, you are the Messiah. And the next, in a sense, set of chapters, 8 chapters or so, which we've started to break into here in 9, and the story we've just read tips us, in one sense, to a turning point in the story as Jesus most definitely heads towards Jerusalem, is going to lead us increasingly to reflect on Son of God. What exactly does that mean? As the centurion who witnesses the death of Jesus declares, truly this man has a relationship with God that is different from others. How different? That is the question. That is the question that those first disciples were grappling with. They knew that historically, biblically speaking, the Messiah, the Christ, the King of Israel was in a sense the adopted Son of God, had that relationship with God by anointing. But as they get to know Jesus more and more, they're beginning perhaps to think beyond that, to think the unthinkable as to how is Jesus exactly related to God. Let's turn for a few moments as we read Mark chapter 9, verses 1 to 13, the story of the Transfiguration. It is a very familiar story, one that hardly needs any of us to stand up and explain. In one sense, it is so powerful and so obvious just in the reading of the story itself. As Jesus takes three disciples, clearly three key disciples, three key apostles as witnesses with him up onto a mountain. The whole scene, as Mark describes it, as each of the gospel writers describe it, as undoubtedly Jesus created it and God ordained it, is a recreation of some of the many mountain scenes that the old scriptures had, but supremely of Moses as he meets God on the top of a mountain, and later Elijah, who possibly runs to the same mountain in the hope of seeing God, and God graciously appears to Elijah, at least speaks to Elijah through the sound of silence. Mountains where God is met and where God appears to humans, which they knew he had done in the times past. And as Jesus takes these three men to the top of the mountain, I wonder whether they were anticipating something. I don't know. I want us for a few moments this morning to enter into the mind and the thoughts and feelings of those three disciples as they climbed the mountain with Jesus. Was Jesus talking on the way up? Was he explaining? Was he giving them some sense of anticipation as to what they were going to see on top of the mountain? Were they asking questions like Abraham's son about what was going to happen at the top of the mountain? I can't imagine that they just went up silently. Or maybe they did. Gradually, as they reached the top, lapse into silence. Silence of uncertainty, silence of anticipation, maybe just tiredness, because one account tells us that they fell asleep. But it happened. That incredible transfiguration of Jesus. A moment where the human body of Jesus, as perhaps now we understand it, where the human body of Jesus sharing the total divinity of God present in human form, the human body for a moment no longer able to conceal the glory that was truly within. And the glory of God shines. Jesus shines with a light that no human eye could handle or even recreate. And then, of course, there's Elijah and Moses. Did you notice in the text there, it was Elijah and Moses. That was the order that Mark records it. Although Peter, when he decides this is a good time to build a shelter, three shelters for Moses, Elijah and Jesus, reverses the order. But Elijah and Moses appear with Jesus there on the mountain. Now there's lots of questions. How did they know it was Elijah and Moses? How did they get to understand and recognize these people? Can't answer those. What kind of conversations went on as to how they got to understand what was happening before their eyes? Did Jesus have to explain it to them? We don't know. But what happened was Jesus takes a moment to reveal his true identity, full identity rather than true identity, his full identity. And at the same time, there standing with them is the mighty prophet Elijah and the mighty prophet leader Moses. And there's no doubt that these two characters are meant to both be representative of the covenant that God had made with his people and the relationship that Israel had had with their God on mountaintops established down through the centuries. But also, as we've seen, as we've been reading through the Gospel of Mark, the miracles that Jesus were performing, Mark in his writing has constantly connected Elijah, Elisha with Jesus and John the Baptist, clearly demonstrating that this is the era we are now in. And in the Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures, the last book of that version, which is the last book in our Old Testament of Malachi chapter 4 and verse 5 and 6, reminds us that there was this expectation that God would send Elijah before the end of the era, when God would bring to fruition all of his plans as prophesied. And then, of course, the feeding of the multitudes and the walking on the water, the ability to provide food for God's people, and the ability to control water. Well, it wasn't exactly Moses who controlled the water, but God through Moses parted the water, and Jesus' miracles of walking on the water and calming the storm clearly connected Jesus with these two amazing figures from the Old Testament. And undoubtedly, the Transfiguration was, shall we say, Jesus's way of stamping his approval on Peter's confession or statement of faith. You are the Messiah, you are the Christ. And almost in literal glory, Jesus demonstrates, yes, he is. And in one sense, we could stop the story there and stop the clock there and say, well, that's the Transfiguration. It affirms that Jesus truly is the Messiah. But of course, that isn't enough in the context of the day, when there were many anticipations of Messiah, when there were many concepts of how that Messiah would work, and the contextual situation of rescuing Israel from Rome and all of those dimensions. The question that has to be asked is, what type of Messiah, and how is he going to do the work of God and do what we believe the Messiah is to do? But both in terms of the identity and the purpose, the Transfiguration is pushed beyond that. If Peter had in mind that Jesus is on par with Moses and Elijah and asks for the three tabernacles, the three temporary shelters to be constructed, possibly thinking of the festival of booths, and thinking of how that was linked to the anticipation of the end time of the kingdom of God coming, God quickly corrects Peter's thinking, or rather pushes Peter's thinking into the unthinkable. It's not enough to put Jesus on the level with Elijah and Moses, because in truth, he is beyond that. And so the cloud descends and the voice speaks. This is my one and only Son, my beloved Son, my only Son who I love. Many translators have struggled to translate the simplicity and profundity of what God says here. He is the one, the Son, the one I love, the one in whom, as he says elsewhere, I am well pleased, the one who ultimately, totally and only is able to bring satisfaction to God's heart in the way that the rest of humanity, for he is human, the rest of humanity we have failed to do. God's unique and special Son. How much of what that Peter grasped, and John and James in that moment, I don't know. But it certainly establishes the point that they have to start thinking the unthinkable, that Jesus is just not a Messiah in the sense of another one of the prophets, but that he is in a category of his own and needs the honor and respect in a unique category that places him that close to God. As we go on through the gospel, as we go through the death and resurrection and on into the revelation that comes after Pentecost, and the clarity then comes that this is God the Son in human form, who we now worship as we worship Jesus this morning, along with the Father and the Spirit. The disciples are forced to think the unthinkable. But if that wasn't enough, and there's a sense in which it is enough, because again, we could just stop the sermon here. We could just stop and say, okay, Second point, you could say, but in another sense, main point, it's all about Jesus. It's Jesus only. And as indeed the scene closes and they are left only with Jesus, enough, you could say, enough. We've learnt enough. And there's a very real sense, if you look back to chapter 9, verse 1, that we are seeing the power of the kingdom of God. Jesus said, some of you standing here will not see death until, well, you could say, see the power of the kingdom of God. And certainly the power of the kingdom of God is just manifest so graphically in the very person of Jesus. But if you listen carefully to what Jesus says, he doesn't say see the power of the kingdom of God. He says seeing the kingdom of God come in power. And as you read verse 9, chapter 9, verse 1 into verse 2, you could say, well, the Transfiguration is seeing the kingdom of God come in power. But when you reflect on it in the context of the whole gospel, and we've only got to the middle yet, we haven't got to the climax of the gospel, which is clearly taking us somewhere else, we are confronted with the other unthinkable. If to monotheistic Jews who believed that God was utterly, uniquely one and other from all else, and none else could share his glory, to think that this person, Jesus, is in a unique relationship with God that shares his glory, that was unthinkable. Here's the other unthinkable that they're being confronted with. It is what has become familiar to us, rightly so, the death and resurrection of the Messiah. It is the ultimate unthinkable that the Messiah should die. As you read carefully around the Transfiguration, you begin to see that this is actually what Jesus is trying to convey to his disciples. And it is the anticipation of a crushed hope. Because he knows that they are over anticipating, or they are anticipating that he will do now what he knows belongs to another period. And he knows that he is moving towards a death and then a resurrection. But the death has to be handled first, and that is unthinkable. You notice in chapter 8, I'll pick up my Bible here for a moment and flick with you. Please, if you've got a Bible open, do it. Have a look at chapter 8. In chapter 8, back in 31, it says, "Then Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things." When was that? That was just after Peter's confession or statement, "You are the Christ." Then Jesus began to shape their thinking and to help them think the unthinkable, that the Messiah must die. As you go on forward, just verse 34, just following on, then Jesus called the crowd. It just follows on. Then he called the crowd and said to his disciples, "If anyone wants to follow me, he must deny himself and take up his cross." There is no other explanation or meaning for taking up your cross unless you are anticipating a painful death by execution. There is no other meaning that you can take from what Jesus is saying there, other than a warning that the pathway of following Jesus is not an easy pathway, and it will lead through death. And then, of course, here in the reading we've had today, verse 9 of chapter 9, as they were coming down from the mountain, just after getting that glorious sense of who Jesus is, he told them not to tell anyone until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. You can see what the topic of conversation is as far as Jesus is concerned. It's not focusing on who I am and how glorious I am. It is on trying to get them to understand the pathway he has to go on. Carry on in verse 12. They start a bit of eschatological theology. We're very good at this as people. When somebody says something really serious that needs to be dealt with, we change the subject. So he's trying to communicate about his death, and they change the subject to the glorious end of era when the Messiah will reign as king over all the earth, and he will not allow it. He flips them back. Why is it written that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be despised? And then that's why I took the reading all the way through to verse 32, because that's where the incident, in a sense, truly ends, you could say. Jesus didn't want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples and telling them that the Son of Man will be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and 3 days again he will arise. The more you read around the Transfiguration, as glorious as it is, thinking the unthinkable, that Jesus is in some senses Son of God in a unique way that no king of Israel ever was, we're also confronted with the unthinkable, that the Messiah must die. If you read in Luke, actually, Luke chapter 9, the same incident, we're told that the topic of conversation between Moses, Elijah, and Jesus was his exodus in Jerusalem, his departure, not his arrival, not his arrival in Jerusalem, his departure, exodus from Jerusalem, carrying a cross outside the city gates and a body laid in the tomb outside the city gates. What a topic of conversation. As perhaps Moses and Elijah asked question of Jesus, is it really? Does this have to happen? And then as you read the story in Matthew, I was struck last week, actually, in another context. Somebody read Matthew 16, those glorious words, I will build my church. Do you remember them? I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against them. And I'm sure, like me, most of us immediately, when we read that statement, I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail against them, we immediately think, I think, of a mighty warrior with a huge army attacking a city and bursting through the gates because the gates can't keep Jesus out. I was reminded as I read the margin of my Bible, as I reread it, actually what Jesus was talking possibly about is the statement, I will build my community and death itself will not be an obstacle. Because the gates of hell, the gates of Hades, the gates of Sheol were simply an idiom for death. And Jesus was actually saying to Peter, I will build my church and I will build it through the domain of death. In building my church, I will go through death, and death will not be an obstacle. And it just reaffirms, as they have to grasp the unthinkable, that the Messiah is going to die. Now we know why. They knew why. If they'd only read Isaiah 53 in that moment, they may have put two and two together as they did post-Pentecost. And we've just shared bread and we've just drunk from a cup again and acknowledged and realized that we have hope. We have hope that is uncrushable. We have hope that can never be destroyed because somebody went through death for us and on our behalf, taking all that sin itself and our rebelliousness and everything associated with that and the consequences of that on himself, so that we may have the kind of hope that will not just carry us through life, but carry us into death with the same confidence of Jesus. I will build my church, and death itself will not be an obstacle. We will trust Jesus, we will follow him, and death itself will not be an obstacle. We have been, by grace and by the working of the Spirit, taught to think the unthinkable, that we live with a form of life in Christ that will never die. And so the hope of the resurrection, understanding not just who Jesus is, not just understanding the identity of the Messiah, but understanding the purpose and pathway that the Messiah has to walk on. It leads us to, we'll catch it later next year when we look in Mark 10, to that probably the main verse of Mark, if you want to sum it up, for the specially appointed one, Mark 10:45, for the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as the price to set many free. Thinking the unthinkable. It's probably no wonder then, and I'll finish by just referring to that rather long story that gets tucked into the middle, verses 14 to 29. And I'm going to suggest to you to have a think about it, but it kind of looks to me, and again, that Mark tells this lengthy story. It does fit into the context in terms of chronology, but tells this rather lengthy story. Again, he pushes it into the middle of the main story. And therefore we need to think, why has he pushed this story in? And it is a story, of course, about unbelief. Grappling with unbelief. That's what the disciples were doing. They believed that Jesus was the Messiah, but they couldn't believe what he was telling them that he was going to do. We saw that in verse 32 when he says again, I will die. They didn't understand his statement. They couldn't even ask questions about it. It was so beyond their belief. In the incident of the young boy who is in some way overcome by a spirit and has been overcome by a spirit repeatedly from childhood, as his father says, and as the disciples tried to cast out the spirit and fail, and whether that was the topic of the argument with the experts of the law, we don't know, we're not really told. And then that conversation, that interesting conversation Jesus has with the father as to what is wrong with the child. And then the father's statement, if you are able to do anything, have compassion on us and help us. And Jesus, and again, the tone of voice, Paula read it well, I think. The tone of voice, Jesus is incredulous almost. If you are able, he's quoting the Father. He's kind of saying, I've tried to say who I am. I've tried to demonstrate what I can do, or rather what God can do, and my relationship with God. And you're still asking the question, if you're able to do anything about this, can you help me? If you are able, Jesus says, all things are possible for the one who believes. And the Father with those glorious words, really, isn't it? I believe, help my unbelief. I don't know how you find yourself in your faith journey, but grappling with unbelief is the most important part of our human faith journeys. We are not God, as one of the songs we sang earlier said. We believe, and often we live in functional unbelief. That's why I said grappling with functional unbelief. I'm sure if we went around the room here, we'd all put our hands up and say, we believe all of these things. But then the challenges of daily life, and then God leading us in pathways that are often unthinkable, or having to understand aspects of God that we perhaps think unthinkable as he challenges our beliefs. We grapple often with a failure to believe and to trust God and to actually follow God into the pathways that to us seem to be impossible pathways, unthinkable pathways, which is precisely where Jesus is taking his disciples as they start moving towards Jerusalem. And I find it really interesting. I'm sure you've observed it too. But when the disciples get to the house and they say to Jesus, how come we couldn't cast out that spirit? Remember that they had been empowered to cast out evil spirits. And Mark has given testimony that they did it very successfully. And yet in this incident, the disciples fail. And Jesus, I don't know how to get the tone of voice right in verse 29. Why couldn't we cast out this spirit? He told them, this kind can only come out by... And I'm sure when Jesus was about to finish that sentence, they were expecting some fairly complicated formula to say this particular evil spirit is really, really dangerous and lives in a particular place and has all kinds of names and associations. So you have to do this and you have to do that and you have to jump here and you have to go there and you have to fast and do lot. The biblical text that's best attested simply says this kind only comes out by prayer. I don't know if he was being ironic or he was joking. I mean, the Jewish people have been praying for millennia. Christians, we've been praying for millennia. And Jesus has the audacity to say that you can only cast out this evil spirit if you pray. Are we not praying? I just find listening to Jesus so amazing. Because I guess, in a sense, what he's simply saying is, if you would just understand who I am, and that you would just trust me, and that you would just follow me, and it will mean following me through death, then ask, and it will be given to you. That the prayer that humbly seeks, and what it's about really is acknowledging that I can't, but God can. Like that song earlier on, I'm not God. I can't, but God can. Prayer, the submission of ourselves to God's will not just carry us through with hope when hope is lost from a human perspective, but actually will enable us to minister, will enable us to cast out evil spirits, will enable us to bring the healing that is needed, will enable us to bring the reconciliation, will enable us to do the good that God wants us to do as we cooperate with God in his way, not in our way, but in his way. May God help us and encourage us from this passage and lead us on with hope and open minds and hearts to learn and trust in the pathways that Christ will lead us for his name's sake. Amen.